Looks like everyone is here. This will be recorded. Just wanted to let you know you all have heard that this will be recorded now. Welcome to Mind Matters, supporting your loved one with PTSD in civilian life. My name is Cassie Peterson, and I will be your host for the evening. And we have Dr. Peter Grau, Dr. Rebecca Serpata, Josh and Rhiannon Roth, and myself joined tonight. And just to do a brief introduction with everyone. So Dr. Serpata is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry, a research scientist in the VA Center for Clinical Management Research, and an attending clinical psychologist at the Ann Arbor VA. She is a practicing clinical psychologist with 15 years of experience delivering evidence-based psychotherapy to veterans and civilians with PTSD. Dr. Serpata leads a research program to adapt and implement evidence-based PTSD treatment across a variety of practice settings, including community health centers, employee assistance programs, primary care clinics, and VA medical centers. The overarching goals of her research program are to improve the effectiveness of evidence-based psychotherapy and to improve training and support for therapists providing these treatments. Dr. Peter Grau is an assistant professor in the University of Michigan's Department of Psychiatry, staff psychologist at the Ann Arbor VA, and research investigator at the VA Center for Clinical Management Research. Dr. Grau's research focuses on advancing the effectiveness and implementation of evidence-based approaches for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, across multiple levels of care and healthcare settings, with the goal of improving mental health outcomes, especially for veterans and individuals with chronic substance use. His work also explores the intersection of therapist-delivered and digital interventions across multiple timescales and other therapeutic avenues of change to design and implement scalable interventions delivering effective treatments for patients. And Josh, I'm going to introduce both Josh and his wife, Rhiannon. So Joshua Paul Roth was born and raised in Prospect, Pennsylvania, and graduated from high school in June of 2001. On July 17th of 2001, he joined the United States Army as an infantryman and attended basic training in airborne school at Fort Benning, Georgia. In early 2002, Private Roth reached his first duty station at Fort Bragg, which is now Fort Liberty, North Carolina, and was assigned to one of the Army's 2 long-range surveillance companies. In February of 2003, he deployed for the first time to Kuwait and further into Iraq in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom, or OIF. Following his return from the 12-month deployment for OIF, Specialist Roth attended the Special Forces Assessment and Selection course, from which he completed and subsequently attended the Special Forces Qualifications course. After graduation, he was assigned to the 5th Special Forces Group Airborne in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, as a Special Forces Communications Sergeant. During his time there, he deployed a total of 16 times to countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Jordan, Bahrain, Oman, Yemen, and Turkey. He achieved the rank of Chief Warrant Officer 2 and served as a Special Forces Communications Sergeant, Special Forces Intelligence Sergeant, Special Forces Assistant Detachment Commander, and Sensitive Activities Director. In 2018, Chief Warrant Officer Roth was reassigned to Special Operations Command Central at MacDill Air Force Base, where he deployed 2 more times and served as the Chief of Operations overseeing all Special Operations Forces sensitive activities in the Middle East. He retired from active duty as a Chief Warrant Officer 3 on January 31st, 2023, and has since served as a defense contractor subject matter expert to Special Operations Command and Central Command. Joshua's awards and several decorations include Legion of Merit, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Meritorious Service Medals, 4 Army Commendation Medals with a C device, Joint Service Commendation Medals, and Joint Service Achievement Medal, Army Achievement Medal, Joint Meritorious Unit Award, 2 Meritorious Unit Commendations, Valorious Unit Award, Afghanistan Campaign Medal with Campaign Star, Iraq Campaign Medal with 6 Campaign Stars, Combat Infantryman Badge, Special Forces Tab, Master Parachutist Badge, and Military Freefall Parachutist Badge with Bronze Service Star. Joshua is married to Rhiannon, and Rhiannon is born and raised in She is a born and raised Michigander from Muskegon, Michigan, and graduated from Mona Schwartz High School in 2003. Following graduation from high school, Rhiannon moved to Cary, North Carolina, and eventually Clarksville, Tennessee, where she first integrated into military lifestyle and eventually met Josh through their shared love of Wolverine football. Rhiannon spent significant time in the restaurant business, eventually becoming the general manager of a restaurant just outside Tampa, Florida. After the shutdown imposed by COVID, Rhiannon pivoted away from the restaurant business and now works for USAA, where she assists veterans and their families on a daily basis. Josh and Rhiannon have 5 children: Catherine, Sean, Jacob, Michaela, and Uriah. And that is who we're all going to talk with. And a little more about me is I am sort of the intersection of the two groups. I have been a research coordinator, part of Dr. Zapata's lab for the last 5 to 6 years. And I am also a military veteran with 16 years of service between the Air Force Active Duty, Air National Guard, and Air Force Reserves. And that will wrap up our introductions and on to our presenters. So we will start with Dr. Peter Grau's presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cassie, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very excited to be here with all of you tonight to talk a little bit about trauma, PTSD, and to answer some questions. I know we've already gotten some wonderful questions from all of you, so very excited. My role tonight is going to be to talk about trauma and PTSD and to give kind of a broad level overview. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be giving some definitions and types of different trauma, how that can lead into post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, talk a little bit about risk factors and some very broad takeaways and directions for treatment that we have for PTSD. So to start with definitions and types. So this definition is very much from our broad clinical and research background. The definition of trauma in some places, I think, can get very expansive. So right here, what I'm doing is actually giving the definition that we tend to use in clinical practice and research. So trauma here is defined as an event, set of events, or circumstances in which there is actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Now, this can be directed at the self, so things like childhood maltreatment or witnessing other people, witnessing domestic violence, witnessing someone getting shot, for instance. Potential traumas, there are quite a few, as you might guess from this type of definition. War combat, of course, for our veterans is a very common type of trauma. Childhood maltreatment, domestic violence, potentially life-threatening or serious accidents, so something like a motor vehicle accident or car accident. But it can also be something like a natural disaster, earthquakes, hurricanes, tsunamis, etc. So as you can see, there are a lot of different avenues by which someone can be exposed to a traumatic event. But the way that gets into PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, is starting with this criterion A. And this is how we define this in our diagnostic manual. So was the person exposed to a trauma? Do they have intrusion symptoms? Do they have avoidance? Do they have negative thoughts or mood? Do they have arousal? And do those symptoms last for more than 1 month? And I'm going to go into detail about what all of these actually look like for the people who you might know who have PTSD or the people you might encounter if you're anyone who does any type of treatment. So let's go a little more into this first criterion A. Was the person exposed to a trauma? So again, were they exposed to that death, threatened death, so the potential for death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in a myriad potential ways? So this could be direct exposure. This could actually be witnessing the trauma. So for instance, one that comes up quite a bit in our veterans are, maybe there's an IED explosion. They're not the ones who are in the midst of it, but they watch it happen, right? It's happening roadside. They're in one vehicle. It's happening to another vehicle. Witnessing that trauma could potentially result in PTSD. It can also happen when you learn that a relative or a close friend was exposed to a trauma. This is less common, but still can absolutely be a pathway to PTSD. An example of this might be the phone call where you learn that a loved one or a close comrade or friend was killed in action or experienced some type of serious threat or sexual violence. All of that can actually that learning process, that phone call, the time when you find out about the trauma can actually lead to PTSD as well. And then for our medics, our first responders, indirect exposure to the aversive details of a trauma, typically in the course of professional duties. So this is oftentimes when there is quite a bit of blood, guts, gore in the aftermath of a trauma, and the job is either cleanup or trying to help the people who have been, for instance, in a medic role, someone who's been shot, someone who's had an explosion and some type of bodily injury, constantly in the course of your professional duties being exposed to those details and seeing the aftermath of a trauma again and again can also lead to the development of PTSD. So we'll have many roads to Rome, and that'll be important as we think about what PTSD looks like, because there are many ways for this to develop, and that means that there are many ways that it can show up in someone's life when they do develop PTSD. So the second criteria, those are our intrusion symptoms. And this means that the traumatic event as it happened is persistently re-experienced in a number of different ways. So this can be unwanted, upsetting memories, and it's important to distinguish that from intentionally thinking about it. So sometimes when you have, maybe one of the worst days of your life, typically, you'll go back and you want to think about it. You want to kind of work it through, why did this happen? And that absolutely can happen with PTSD. But this specific symptom is more about those unwanted memories. You don't want to think about the worst day of your life. You're pushing that away. You don't want it to happen, but it's popping in anyway. And those memories are typically very vivid. We think of them as almost flashbulb memories. They may not be complete, which we'll talk about in a bit, but generally speaking, the details of traumatic memories are very, very intense and vivid, and they're coming in unwanted. And that can also happen in the form of nightmares. So it's not always an exact reliving of the trauma, but oftentimes it's very, very close, where at night, our veterans especially will have almost a reenactment of combat or something very close to something that, the details maybe have changed a little bit, but generally speaking, they're reliving the trauma while they're asleep in the form of a nightmare, sometimes 2 to 3, maybe even more times per week. Now, the one that is, I think, the most commonly portrayed in media, but is actually slightly less common, are flashbacks. And so the way that you want to distinguish this from intrusive or upsetting memories are flashbacks are when you're essentially losing the room. It's more of a full sensory movement from the current present moment back to the moment of the trauma. So this is where you are smelling the gunpowder. You feel as if you're actually back in that moment. And keep in mind, there's only one symptom that's required for this to have PTSD. So a lot of veterans don't actually have flashbacks, but when they do, they are very, very intense. They're very, as you might guess, they're very disturbing, upsetting. And they tend to be one of the most debilitating symptoms that veterans might have if they do have PTSD. And as you might guess from all of those symptoms, emotional distress is a kind of a necessary component of this. When you're reliving the worst day of your life, when you're experiencing some of those details and you don't want to be, there's going to be a lot of potentially fear, anger, maybe disgust, depending on the trauma. So that emotional distress, when you are reminded of things that bring some of those memories back. And then to go along with that, physical reactivity. Right? You can imagine if you're starting to feel those emotions, if you're having those memories, palms start to get sweaty, heart rate goes up. It's extremely difficult, and you have this physical reactivity to the traumatic reminders as well. The next kind of main driver of PTSD, I kind of think of this as the engine, is avoidance. So avoidance of trauma-related stimuli after the trauma. And so when I say trauma-related stimuli, what I mean is, people, places, objects in the world that remind you of the trauma. So if you might kind of imagine, let's say the trauma is an IED explosion roadside. That's the trauma, right? So something that might remind you of that in regular civilian life transitioning back might be any loud noise, any honking horn, the smell of gunpowder can absolutely bring that back. And this can broaden out because what's happening is the body is actually activating a protection mode. Essentially, the body's trying to make sure that we are safe, but it tends to overgeneralize. So these trauma-related stimuli are things that remind us of the trauma. And so what happens then, of course, because you're activating this protection mode, you don't want to encounter those trauma-related stimuli. So what happens is people tend to avoid trauma-related thoughts or feelings. Again, worst day of your life. You don't want to think about it. You're pushing it away. You don't want to feel that anxiety, that anger, potentially, the fear that comes with reliving that memory. So push it away, which works really well in the short term, but not so well in the long term. And I'll go into that a little bit more. Also, avoiding those trauma-related reminders. So that means with that, maybe with that IED explosion, people might stop driving to work. They find alternate routes. Maybe their commute goes from 20 minutes to an hour because they don't want to potentially have to experience a loud noise or traffic. They might stop going places where there are a lot of people because the crowds are overwhelming and it feels as if they're back in a moment where they didn't have any control, right? So trauma, it creeps, it expands out into various parts of life. And avoidance is part of that. Avoidance tends to be the driver, the engine that keeps PTSD going because it means that we're not able to process what happened in that moment. And that is very much tied in with these negative alterations in thoughts or moods, so these negative changes in the way we think about ourselves, other people in the world, and in our mood. This can look a lot like depression. This can look a lot like anger. But some of the things that come up with these negative alterations, one, inability to recall key features of the trauma. So you remember I said that there's this kind of flashbulb memory that tends to come in where you have very vivid detail available. This is true, but also trauma memories are usually not stored in a very linear or coherent way. So there are certain parts of the trauma that you might just not have encoded. So key parts of the memory might just not be available. It's almost as if there's a black spot within the traumatic memory, which can be extremely distressing, right? You remember all of these important details, and all of a sudden there's something that people think, I should remember this, but I don't. And this can happen for a variety of reasons. Attention is drawn elsewhere. We're not 100% sure why this happens, but it does tend to be something that pops up with PTSD quite a bit, this disorganized storing of memory. Then we have these overly negative thoughts and assumptions about yourself or the world. Right? So this is where exaggerated blame, thinking that the world is unsafe, thinking that no one can be trusted. It's a change typically for people from a worldview where I can trust other people, good things are going to happen, and then this huge moment, this meteorite hits, and the worldview completely shifts. So oftentimes, individuals with PTSD have a very hard time maintaining friendships, maintaining relationships, because there are these overly negative, generalized thoughts that I can't trust anyone, no one's going to understand me. And in some ways, right, this makes sense in a smaller context because they've experienced something that most other people have not, and it's very hard for people with PTSD to fully express what it's like to have experienced this trauma. So this can cause this alienation between themselves and other people. And this is kind of a two-way street then. I'm not able to share with people because it's really hard to think about this. I want to avoid it at all costs. But then people aren't able to connect with me as well. And this can also come into then exaggerated blame of the self or potentially other people for causing the trauma. When something that shakes your worldview happens, there's this drive to make meaning from it. There's this drive to understand, why did this happen? And for a lot of people, especially a lot of veterans who are extremely independent, they are capable. One of the ways that trauma kind of gets in, it kind of changes your thoughts subtly, is it starts, well, I'm very capable. I'm able to do many things. If something went wrong, it's probably my fault. So we see this quite a bit in our veterans, where all of a sudden something like a roadside bombing becomes I should have seen it coming. I should have done something different. In the morning, if I had just decided that I was going to go this different route as opposed to the route I went, this would have never happened, right? This kind of push for control, which is a very lonely experience because then it becomes kind of turning on the self. So these changes in cognition are very, very damaging and very common. And then these last four are, they look a lot like depression because they are essentially depression, right? So negative affect, negative emotion, lots of difficulty experiencing positive feelings as well. And you imagine if most of your life is taken up trying to not think about the worst day of your life, trying to avoid anything that might remind you of that trauma and filled with negative thoughts about yourself and that you can't trust other people, naturally over time you tend to go out fewer places, you tend to engage with friends less often, with family less often, and that isolation can breed this depressive profile that we see a lot in veterans with PTSD. And then there's our criterion E rather, and these are arousal symptoms. And this, I think, a lot of families and spouses and loved ones, people with PTSD, this can often feel like the most pressing concern. These arousal symptoms, and we need two of these for a diagnosis, but they're pretty broad actually. So one of the first ones is irritability or aggression. And now again, if you imagine you're spending all this time trying not to think about the worst day of your life, you're having these memories come into your head. You're not able to forgive yourself potentially, or you're angry at the world. Inevitably, you're going to be tense. You're constantly kind of watching out. You're going to get a little irritable. At least a lot of people do. And that can then sometimes for our veterans take the form of aggression, sometimes towards the self in the form of self-harm, sometimes towards other people. Almost like I can't handle all of these emotions and these thoughts and these feelings that are coming in constantly, and it just needs to get out. This happens quite a bit with PTSD, and anger is actually one of the most common issues that bring people to therapy. Riskier destructive behavior as well. And now this is, you know, some people will have this, other people not at all. And you can imagine for some people, it's I'm avoiding all potential danger. I will not be in any place that could put me in harm's way because that kind of triggers these thoughts of fear, these anxious feelings. But for other people, there is this almost dampening down entirely of emotions. I'm trying to not think about the trauma. I'm trying to avoid feeling isolated, and eventually there's this numbing almost that can happen because it's too much, and to survive, I need to just get rid of emotions as best I can. But what can happen then is there are moments where people need to feel something. And this is where, I'll have veterans come in and say, I was feeling kind of numb and isolated for a while, and then all of a sudden I found myself going 120 on my bike down the highway at 12:30 in the morning, and I just do that sometimes, right? So that risky or destructive behavior, gambling is a big one as well. Kind of saying I just decided to take this massive risk, and I wouldn't. It's out of character. I would have never done that. This push to feel something, and this is another one often, right? You can see that might bring someone into therapy. Say like, hey, for some reason I'm having these moments where I'm just doing this really risky or destructive behavior, and then we can trace that back to trauma. Hypervigilance, this is kind of a classic symptom of PTSD, and this just means I'm constantly on the lookout for potential danger, right? The danger system, that protection system, it is overactive because I'm reliving this trauma and I'm constantly in that place where I need to be vigilant. So this is something where if you're overseas and you're in a war zone, this is very adaptive, right? You need to be ready. You need to be able to scan for threats constantly. But then when you're back in, let's say you're home in rural Michigan, the brain doesn't turn that off all the way, especially with PTSD. So what'll happen is over time, these become ingrained as habits. So clinically, what we see often is sometimes veterans don't even really realize how hypervigilant they're being, but it might come as something like, for instance, if they were in my house currently, I have a window here, I have a door behind me. I would probably not be, if I had PTSD, I probably wouldn't be sitting with my back to the door because that's a potential that's an entrance and that's unprotected, right? So kind of thinking constantly about, if I go to a restaurant, I have to have my back to the wall. I have to be able to see everything, right? I have to check the doors and locks. And sometimes when I ask people, can you give me a sense of how often you do that? And they say, oh, I think it's 4 to 5 times a day, maybe. And then when they actually go and check it, they're like, oh, it's 20 to 30 because we need this moment when you have PTSD of reducing that anxiety. I need to feel safe. But this becomes a pretty destructive cycle over time because you're not just checking a couple of times, you have to continuously check because that danger feels ever present. Yeah. One of the biggest ones that comes up now is cameras, right? So cameras are great for home security. They're a wonderful thing in some ways, but they also can go on our phones, which means if you think about checking and being hyper vigilant, that might mean that some veterans with PTSD checking their cameras 50 times a day. So they're not able to be kind of fully present in other activities. They're constantly in that threat detection system. And as you might guess, if you are constantly hyper alert, you're hyper aware, you're looking for threat, you have that danger radar going. If anything were to, startle you, if you were to all of a sudden have something happen where you were not anticipating it, boom, through the roof. And that can look like, someone drops a cup, a loud noise, generally speaking. People with PTSD, because they have that threat detection system going, they're wound very tight, which makes sense, right? That's what you would, if you're kind of always looking, you're going to be ready to go at all times. And so when something startles them, it's a very big reaction. And all of that results in difficulty concentrating and difficulty sleeping, right? If your brain is constantly focusing on potential threats, trying to avoid these reminders of trauma and PTSD, it's going to be really hard to actually concentrate on what you're doing. And it's going to be very hard then to turn off. And so going to sleep is very, very difficult because it's this constant, I'm on guard, and then the body's not able to fully relax. So altogether, that's a pretty difficult existence for people with PTSD. These symptoms are not easy. And when we look at kind of the other criteria for it, they're going to create distress, functional impairment, as you might guess. Typically, the symptoms have to last for more than 1 month. And I say that a lot of people will have some of these symptoms after a trauma, but they go away. It's going to last quite a bit longer for people with PTSD, and oftentimes they don't come to treatment for 5 to 10 years. Right? So then just very briefly, I wanted to touch on some risk factors. The things that we know that make it more likely that someone's going to develop PTSD are pre-trauma psychopathology and developmental trauma exposure. So trauma begets trauma in a lot of ways. The more traumas people experience over time, the more it happens kind of sequentially, the more likely it is that they're going to develop PTSD. So someone who's had 10 criterion A traumatic exposures over time is more likely to get PTSD than someone who's had one. And so this is why in a lot of veterans we see if they do develop PTSD, sometimes it can actually happen from a single combat exposure. Absolutely, that's possible. But a lot of our veterans actually have previous trauma histories as well when they go on to develop PTSD. And it becomes kind of a straw that broke the camel's back. Sex and gender. Some of this are, I won't get too far into this, but people who are assigned female at birth tend to be at higher risk of developing PTSD. There's a lot of interesting research in here. Some of it is potentially related to hormonal differences. Some of it then, when we go to gender, is just rates of different traumatic exposures. So people who are presenting as women, they are much more likely to experience sexual assault. Now, men absolutely experience sexual assault. That is something that is not talked about as much. There's a lot of stigma around it, and we need to talk about it more. In terms of raw numbers, women are much more likely to experience sexual assault, and that is one of the traumas that is most likely to lead to the development of PTSD. So military sexual trauma is, the rates are much higher among women than they are among men, which essentially just means that we need to keep thinking about this from both a cultural and a societal lens as well. And then, in terms of the specific trauma type, I mentioned sexual assault. Any interpersonal trauma, so combat trauma is involved in this larger umbrella, but any trauma where there's physical damage or sexual trauma, they're much more likely than potentially a motor vehicle accident, for instance, to cause PTSD. And then after the trauma, lack of access to resources and lack of social support, because you can imagine when something like this happens, that pull to avoid, that pull to blame the self is extremely strong. And if there's any external push to do that, it's more likely that someone's going to develop PTSD. So the idea of, oh, you don't need help, you don't need to talk to anybody, it's fine. That might not be great for a lot of our veterans. And then, someone who experiences stigma, like, what's wrong with you? Any kind of negative reaction is then interpreted as evidence for there is something wrong with me. I am bad. I shouldn't be thinking this. And then that leads to more avoidance and over time, the development of PTSD or the continuation of PTSD. And then there we go. And I wanted to finish up with some treatment takeaways before I send it over to Dr. Serpata. So overall, there are lots of different ways to treat PTSD, and we're working on developing more all the time. Generally speaking, though, approach works well, avoidance does not. Avoidance is helpful in the short term, but not processing the trauma, not kind of working through the trauma, tends to mean that the trauma doesn't actually get better. PTSD does not get better on its own, typically. All right. So doing active, often cognitive behavioral approaches, they have the strongest evidence. So kind of cognitive, we're focusing on those negative cognitions and trying to help people build a more balanced worldview and more balanced view of themselves, other people in the world. And then the behavioral side of it is, what are those things that you stopped doing or avoided because they remind you of the traumatic events? Now, a lot of these involve constructing a potential narrative of the traumatic event and processing it with a therapist, right? Directly targeting that avoidance and saying, we're going to be able to work through this so you can, on the other side of it, build a more coherent narrative that's a little balanced, that doesn't have as much self-blame, but also allows people to fully process the emotions they had in the moment of that trauma, while also figuring out what are the things that you avoided that you really care about that we can get you back into life doing. And but not all of them do. So as long as there is this kind of movement forward and kind of an approach in a safe way, those tend to be really effective. And some examples I'll give are prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, EMDR, written exposure therapy. These are all approach-oriented therapies, and they're all offered at the VA. So many therapists who treat veterans at the VA will be trained in these community providers as well. But I think that's the takeaway generally, is if you can do something that's approach oriented, it has a very good chance of working and helping our veterans move to a different stage with PTSD. So I appreciate the time, and I will turn it over to Dr. Serpata for the next stage of the talk.
Thanks, Dr. Grau. So I'm Rebecca Serpata. I'm going to be talking about a study that we conducted a few years ago, interviewing National Guard service members about their reintegration experiences. And I'm going to present the findings to you today. So this project was funded by several different sources, including a couple of VA projects awarded to Marsha Ballenstein, and the Welcome Back Veterans Initiative, the McCormick Foundation, and the Michigan Army National Guard. And the findings from the study were published in Military Behavioral Health. So the reason that we conducted this study is because we know that National Guard soldiers face unique reintegration challenges. So National Guard soldiers are citizen soldiers who maintain civilian and military roles. And some of the challenges that they experience that are unique to their role include civilian job loss or fear of job loss, a sense of isolation or estrangement from military and civilian friends, and sometimes loss of purpose. We know that 42 to 61% of National Guard soldiers report mental health issues, and we know this from post-deployment assessments that are conducted by the military immediately upon return from deployment. But most do not initiate treatment or do not receive an adequate dose of treatment. So only 54% of soldiers who are referred for treatment end up following up with a mental health visit, and then of those who do follow up, only about 30% receive what we would consider to be an adequate course of therapy or medication for mental health problems. So what are some of the things that get in the way? Well, there are a few different factors that contribute to this problem. In National Guard service members in particular, there are some unique challenges. So logistical issues are challenges that are faced by many different service members and veterans, and these can include financial pressures or concerns about job availability or job security, or lack of available medical or mental health facilities. This can include loss of built-in supports because returning National Guard soldiers are not stationed full-time on military bases, so they don't have access to the types of services that are available on base, including peers with similar deployment experiences or military chaplains or family support programs. And they're often scattered throughout their home states and may not have the types of support that they need. Negative treatment beliefs are another potential barrier, and these are concerns that mental health treatment might not be effective. And stigma is another barrier that, again, can be prevalent for National Guard soldiers or other veterans. And this can include concerns about confidentiality, or concerns about losing promotion opportunities, or concerns about others' perceptions, concerns that those who access services might be perceived as weak, or that they might be blamed for the problem, or that it could potentially harm their career. So these are all the types of things that could get in the way of individuals seeking care for their mental health concerns. And a previous study by our group surveyed National Guard service members about the types of barriers that prevented them from seeking care, and found that the most commonly reported barrier was not wanting it in your military records. Another common barrier was that unit leadership might treat me differently, or that it's embarrassing, that it might hurt my career in the future. And then logistical and practical barriers, such as costs, or not knowing where to go to receive treatment, or not feeling like there were available providers in the community. So what we can see from this is that although we have effective treatments available for PTSD, we need to spend some time and effort figuring out how to overcome stigma and how to overcome some of these associated barriers to treatment seeking and treatment receipt. So that was the motivation for this study. What we did was we collected qualitative data, which is basically open-ended interviews. And this was done as part of a larger evaluation of a peer-to-peer program for returning National Guard soldiers. So we conducted 78 semi-structured interviews in 6 Michigan Army National Guard units, and we sampled them for high and low uptake of the peer-to-peer program. We interviewed individuals between 14 and 25 months after their return from deployment. And we also made sure that we interviewed individuals on a variety of ranks to ensure distribution of rank in the sample. We interviewed them about their reintegration experiences, about their mental health concerns and treatment seeking, about their perceptions of the peer-to-peer program we were evaluating, and about stigma. We recorded the interviews, we transcribed them, conducted the analyses with a multidisciplinary team, and organized the data using matrices, and conducted sites analyses both within units and across units. Here are demographics. These are representative of the Michigan Army National Guard population. You can see the vast majority were male between the age of 18 to 40, had received some college, and were white, and mostly were partnered as well. So I'm going to present some of the themes that we identified in this project. The first theme that we identified was feeling out of step with time and culture, or what we called culture shock. So 12 of the participants noted that the cultural shift back to home life was pretty jarring. So here's an example quote from one of the participants, that it's shell-shocking when you first get home. And one of the adjustments was no longer being in theater. And some of the participants mentioned needing an adjustment period to help acclimate to differences in routine and facilitate the psychological shift to home life. One participant said, what you do is the same day in and day out, time just stops for you, but time here at home doesn't. It still goes that 12 months or whatever. It feels like it's going to be for forever before you get done. But in the end, it felt like it went by like that. I was just gone for a minute, but it wasn't nothing at home. So for this individual, being deployed was described as staying the same, staying static while everyone else moved on. And some individuals felt like the opposite was true, that they experienced personal development while individuals at home stayed the same. So this individual said, it sucked. I was 19 years old, but I was mentally like 33. All my buddies were in their basement smoking pot, playing video games, living with their parents, wasting their lives. I'm going to school to be a pastor. I've gone to combat deployment, and I'm the same age as you are, and you're wasting your life. So collectively, these participants described deployment as an interruption in their lives, and they perceived that their own maturation had either halted or progressed too quickly and widened the gap between themselves and the people in their civilian lives. Another theme we identified was problems with anger and alcohol use. So the most commonly endorsed mental health concern among our participants was anger or irritability. So this individual said, I found myself really agitated, really angry, and still get flustered or anxiety in different situations and different things still quite easily. So the second most commonly endorsed mental health concern was alcohol misuse. And for these individuals, alcohol was described as an escape from other stressors. We also had some individuals experience PTSD and describe symptoms of PTSD, which I'll get to in a minute. A third theme that we identified was social support and renegotiating family roles. So several participants discussed conflict and compromise with their family members, and they noted that their partners were distressed by their perceived emotional withdrawal. So this individual said, even my girlfriend gets upset at me because she's like, you never talk about anything. I don't know what you were doing in Afghanistan. I don't know anything about your deployment. You just don't express emotion at all. So for this individual, withholding information about your deployment, whether because of discomfort with expressing emotion or discomfort eliciting negative emotions from others, was perceived as emotional withdrawal. And some other themes that we noted were changes in routines, adjusting to those, role shifting and transitions, and some describe mismatched expectations about family life. So one topic that was mentioned by several individuals was the transition back to parenting specifically. So this individual said, we compromised a lot because I was used to being in charge over there. She was used to being in charge all the time. And then we kind of clash heads when we got in the middle. So for these individuals, transitioning back into co-parenting took some time and conscious effort. Another theme that we identified was unit support. And for some individuals that represented continued closeness, but for others, there was some limited emotional disclosure and some withdrawal. So the soldiers that we spoke to often said that they were hesitant to share experiences with family and friends, but some said that they were willing to share these experiences with unit members. So one participant said, there's a group, and I mean, I can rely on that group for anything. If I call them, no matter what time, no matter what it is, I can rely on them for whatever situation. There's guys here that are probably actually closer than family. I'd call them faster than I do it for my brother. So for this individual, the unit felt very close and supportive. For others, it was not necessarily the case. Some said that they would only discuss superficial topics and wouldn't talk about mental health concerns specifically. So this individual said, I've never once heard of anybody calling anybody up and just saying, hey man, is everything all right? Like, are you going to be okay? Do you need me to talk anything about anything? It just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen that way. And this sentiment was echoed by several other participants. So it appeared that there occasionally remained reluctance to discuss mental health concerns, even among cohesive and supportive units. A fifth theme we identified was problems with employment and finances or housing. And these themes were not present in quite as many participants, but when they were present, they were enormously disruptive. So 4 participants said that they had experienced financial and employment problems that detrimentally affected their mental health. And this individual said, I got really bored and figured that if I start a job, even making as much as I do on unemployment, at least I'll be doing something constructive. Because if I sit around, my brain seems to think a lot, and it's just not good. A sixth theme that we identified was related to services and health seeking and the barriers and facilitators to that. So 12 individuals said that they had sought mental health services. 7 of them had used mental health services at the VA, and almost all of them were reluctant to do so. And some of them attributed this to stigma. So this individual said, in combat arms, we're the alpha males. We don't want to tell nobody our problems. We're tough, tough, tough. And one told us that he had considered using services, but that his distrust in the Army was a barrier to him seeking services. And an additional participant said he was not comfortable talking about his emotions. So we heard a lot of reluctance and some distrust and uncertainty about service utilization. An interesting thing we observed is that mental health problems were often seen through the lens of the partner, or they were addressed because they affected the partner and affected the family. So one participant noted, and he was talking here about symptoms of hypervigilance, which Dr. Grau was describing. We call it checking the perimeter because I'm constantly checking doors and windows and watching the neighbors and watching everything that goes on. And it was freaking my daughter out. And she's like, Papa, you need help. You need help. So for this participant and several others, it was prompts by family members that led them to recognize the problem and in some cases seek help for that. So in summary, we found that a little over a quarter of individuals reported smooth reintegration experiences. So I don't want to make it seem that everyone we spoke to had difficult reintegration experiences, but others reported challenges that range from minor to major challenges that in some cases significantly diminished their quality of life. And the reintegration problems that they described centered around psychological health, social functioning with family and peers, and job and finances and mental health services. And these issues are, inherent to the roles that National Guard service members inhabit, including the job insecurity and the sense of isolation or estrangement, but they also may be common to other components. Help seeking was not frequently reported. And when mental health problems were discussed, they were often seen through the lens of the partner or the family and addressed because they affected the partner and the family. And for those who had problems, their reasons for seeking help or not seeking help were multifaceted and complex. I do want to mention a few limitations. We interviewed National Guard service members, so our results might not generalize to other regions because our interviews were all conducted in Michigan. They might not generalize to other military components, but some of them may. And we recruited individuals during drill weekend, so it's possible that the individuals that we spoke to might not have had more serious mental health conditions because those with more serious mental health conditions might have ended up separating from National Guard. And then a third limitation is that the main focus of our interview was an evaluation of this peer-to-peer program, so we didn't spend as much time talking about the reintegration experience as we did other domains. But in conclusion, what we can see from this study is that we need additional efforts to facilitate smooth reintegration experiences for National Guard service members and likely other military components. And paying more attention to employment status would be beneficial. And also focusing on social connection and leveraging family members would be a potentially beneficial strategy. And this highlights the importance of programs such as Coaching into Care, which is a VA program that helps family members learn some skills about how to coach their family member to help seek services when it would be indicated. And here are some references if you're interested. And now and that's the end of our presentation. So now I think we are going, hand it over to Cassie.
Yes. Hi. Thank you, Dr. Serrata and Dr. Grau for presenting on that. And now we'd like to invite our lived experience experts, Josh and Rhiannon, to speak.
Well, good evening, everyone. So again, Joshua Roth, this is my wife, Rhiannon. As mentioned before, I spent almost 22 years in the military, active duty, and most of that was spent in Special Forces, 19 total combat deployments where I experienced the wide variety of exposure and trauma, to everything from direct engagement combat, IEDs, mortars, a lot of death and things like that. So I'm going to state up front for anybody that's watching. There might be some things that I say that might be triggering and things like that. So I want to put that out up front. So I was diagnosed about 4 years ago with PTSD. However, I probably had it another 10 to 15 years before that, that it wasn't diagnosed, that I was dealing with the symptoms and issues of PTSD. One thing that I'll add to Dr. Sripada's examples there on reasons why I didn't go seek help. I felt that if I went and sought help for what was going on in my head, that I couldn't do my job. And that was what I was there to do. And I was in an organization that made up less than 1% of the military. We were highly specialized, and everybody was doing these things. And why would I take myself out of the fight in order to go get help for my mental health? That wasn't being a team player, and that wasn't doing those things. So I did see it as weakness, and I saw it as I can't do that. I cannot take myself away from my job. So I never did any of those things. So what I did start doing it, because reintegration as an active duty soldier is extremely difficult, because as she mentioned, you come home, things are not the same at home, because I left here, and for me, this is what I came back to. But for everybody else, I came back over here, and it was very difficult. Plus, when you come home, you're just training for the next event. So you're always in a heightened state. You're always up. You're always ready to go. And the Army and the military put me there, and they never told me how to back it down. And there was never time to back it down. So what I started doing is I started numbing everything about myself, primarily with alcohol. I got to a point in my life where before I would go to work, and before I left work, I would have 6 or 7 drinks before I ever made it home, just because I had to shut everything off, because emotionally I could not deal with the things that were going on at home. And it made me numb, and it impacted my relationships with my family. It impacted relationships with other friends. I had friends that were in my unit, and those were the only friends I had, because those are the only ones that understood me and the things that I was dealing with. So that's how I coped. And it led me to multiple suicide attempts over the course of my life. And those were brought on by feelings of weakness, loneliness, and things like that. You start getting some of those flashbacks. You have some of those nightmares. You start to get those feelings where uh, I'm not any good to anybody. And I've had friends that have been killed or left, and it makes you feel lonely. And sometimes those demons come up, and there was nothing else you could do. You couldn't see or hear anything, and all I wanted to do was escape. So I unsuccessfully tried a total of 3 times throughout the course of my life to commit suicide. Um, and as those few times failed, it and alcohol wasn't doing its job anymore. I got angrier and angrier and angrier, and it really impacted the rest of my life. And it really pushed me to a point where several years ago, I was ready to go. I was going to kill myself, and luckily, I had people that did care for me. Um, and what ended up clicking in my mind at the end of the day was, as I was on my floor in my bedroom, done with everything, and I got a knock on my door from my son, who said there were some sheriffs there that wanted to talk to me. And I came out, and there was 5 sheriffs in my living room, and my kids were all sitting at the table. And to see my kids, it clicked something in my head. And that's kind of when I broke down, and I kind of said to myself, life is more important than the job. And I was still active duty. And the next day, I went into work, and I told my boss, I was like, "Hey, I have to take time off." And I walked into mental health to start seeking treatment. Um, so what I'll say there, when I talk about myself getting treatment and things like that, is I had to come to terms internally that getting help wasn't a bad thing. It was not something that was weak. It was not something that I was doing to run away. Getting help was not bad. And the way I was feeling, while it sucked, it was okay to feel that way. It was okay to have these feelings in my head, and that they weren't abnormal. It was part of all of the things that had happened to me. Um, I did have to learn to trust the process of getting better, because it is not an over the night thing. It wasn't something where I went into a therapy session and I sat down and I talked about my feelings and they talked to me about unicorns and rainbows, and I walked out the next day and everything was fine. I have gone through years, and I still go through therapy. I have done art. I have done EMDR. I've done cognitive processing therapy. I have done many different things because it's not a catch-all. One of those things is not going to fix the problem. It's something that you have to work at. You have to continue to try to want to get better at being a person. So it's something that you can't be afraid to, and you can't give up on the process. Um, so that's kind of where I am, and some of the things in a brief nutshell about how I've gotten to and lived with my PTSD and my experience. And there is so much more, and I welcome the questions here at the end. But I want to take a moment to turn it over to my wife to talk about how she dealt with these things from the outside perspective, on having to deal with all of my issues and things like that. So.
Everyone, again, my name is Rhiannon. So I have been a part of the military, I guess, community for about 19 years. My parents were not in at all or anything. I did have some family members distant. I moved from Michigan to North Carolina, not even related to military at the time, and then kind of slowly gained some military friends as I went, right? Ended up moving into Fort Campbell, Tennessee, Kentucky. We lived there for a long time. With that, there are so many things that I've learned throughout the last 20-ish years. The biggest one was understanding the military soldier, right? They're supposed to be tough. They're supposed to be America badasses. And it's really a struggle when you love somebody so much to not know what to do. You feel helpless. I give the shirt off my back for anybody. I will try to do anything I can to help anybody. And when you're met with such a huge obstacle, as somebody wanting to commit suicide, and you don't know what to say, do you help? Do you fix it? Do you resolve the problem? It's taken a long time, and it has not always been easy. Part of that struggle was, going through the process with him and I, and knowing when to kind of not say anything and let him vent. It's one of those things you grow up with, soldiers, guys, they don't, admit that they have a problem and it's a sign of weakness. And I have very, very much learned, no, everybody is very similar when it comes to that. You're not weak for venting about something. I come home and vent about work. He does the same thing. It's a struggle in the same aspect too, because when he was active duty, I wanted to know everything and he can't tell me. That confidentiality, portion there. I want to know and he can't tell me. And there's things that he doesn't want to talk about, doesn't want to tell me. And it's frustrating. It's, you feel like you go into your own mental spot where, okay, well, he doesn't love me or he doesn't want to talk to me about this. I'm not important. I'm not a priority. And unfortunately, the fact of the matter is you are not listed as that priority because they have been in the military for so long, or if they're just starting out, that is their first thing. They are trained to defend, to protect, to give everything that they can. And when they come home, it's very much of let's, focus on this and this and this. And it was kind of, you take a back seat because those suicides, those negative thoughts, those things like that, you have to take yourself out of that equation and focus more on them. Not that my own doesn't matter, because my own definitely does as well, but it's separating those things and learning when to listen and then when to talk. when to solve those problems and when not to. There was lots of frustrations that we went through. Learning our love language, I think, was our biggest still is, I think, learning about each other. Mine is touch, mine is, quality, where his are acts of kindness and also quality time. Um, they're different when it comes to those things. It's hard knowing that with him, he wants those acts of kindness, right? Those things, you did this, you did that, you folded the laundry, did dishes, whatever it may be. Whereas mine is like, I want you to hold my hand. I want you to cuddle with me, watch a movie. Uh, those are just different things. When he got out of the military, the PTSD started coming in a little bit more. He felt like he didn't have a purpose because, like he said, he's been go, go, go for so long. When he came home, he wasn't go, go, go anymore. That there was no purpose. He got angry. He got so frustrated with so many little things, and making him feel valuable was a struggle. Because I didn't know what to do. Like, I can't give him a gun and be like, yeah, go defend our house. We can't do that. um, with him always being ready to go, it was that time that I had to take the kind of step back and figure out what those triggers were. What are those things that push him over? Does this small thing, and it's some small, some big, and it's learning to get through those things. And it has been trial and error. There's not a book that says, oh, well, this person's name is Josh, and this is how you handle him. It really is. It depends on the person you're with. And it's really that communication is such a big, huge factor when it comes to understanding each other and making it work. The biggest thing when he said about the suicide, with, watching our kids at the table, I was not at the house at the time. I was on the phone with him. My son called us. I said, I'm staying on the phone with him, or called me. And I said, I'm staying on the phone with him. And I just sat on the phone with him. He didn't even know the police were coming. I just waited and waited until I heard the knock on the door. My son texted me. So I knew that was all going on. I'm like, okay. Being there that whole process, he was mad at me. I had no problem taking that hit. It was like, be mad at me. You need to get help. And you can't tell somebody when they don't want help that they need help, because it's taken more as, it's their fault. And it's that blame thing. It's kind of like Dr. Grahl was talking about with those, negative alterations, right? It's his fault, or somebody else's fault, right? He didn't have a lot of friends. Again, with that whole aspect, didn't trust, didn't have friends. I had a whole bunch of friends. I worked in the restaurant business for so long. So when we got together, me having that backboard and him not having that as much, when we got together, it became our friends, like, you'll really like these people. These people really like you. And, kind of going through that aspect. But also talking to our kids was the hardest thing, because I don't want our children thinking that, oh, well, dad has a PTSD, and, oh, he had a suicide attempt, and, oh, yeah, dad's really messed up in the head. They need to understand that that is a common thing, and it doesn't need to be shunned. It doesn't need to be secret, that it needs to be understood and explained. So there's not, this, terrible idea about what this is. If they have problems, they need to be able to open up as well. They don't need to be this hard shell. With the deployments and things like that, it was always 2 weeks. Our dog's playing with the phone. It was always 2 weeks after he left that something happened at the house. Something fell apart. I couldn't talk to him or anything else. And then our life went on. And then, it's kind of like, Dr. Zapata was talking about that 2-week adjustment, having our kids and then having pets as well. But having all of them, me taking care of all that, making sure everything's straight in the house, that, I've gotten everything covered. Meanwhile, he's doing great, wonderful things while he's deployed, and coming home, and I've gotten this handled, this handled, this handled. He has to go from this heightened state constantly to going, I have to kind of let her go a little bit. So it's one of those things that, a transition there. We do have, counseling that we do as well together. I've got my own, he's gotten his own. It does help, but you never stop looking for that additional help because you change as you get up. It's one of those things to deal with. I've seen some questions and stuff come up like, who do you turn to? What do you do? How do you deal with somebody that has that PTSD that you love? Do you tell them? And it honestly depends on your communication. I've had the fortunate circumstance to have, friends that were military. I've had friends that are in law enforcement. I've been able to talk to them, his family too. That is that process that's helped me figure him out, and also with him helping me so I can communicate better to him without him taking it as it's his fault. He deployed, he was in the military, it's his fault. It's not. But I also have to make sure that I do the same thing on my part, that it's not my fault. And we work together on compromising and figuring out where our strengths can become, that biggest thing, an obstacle that we get over.
And I want to take just another minute before we get into questions, because I think that's probably the most important part of a lot of this. I want to talk a second about triggers and seeing things coming and stuff like that. I will tell you that 98% of the time, I don't know when something's going to hit me and I'm going to get into one of those moods that I get into. There will be times I'm just sitting there and I will zone out, and my mind just starts going to another place. It's happened while I've been driving. It is very random. There are things that I do know that trigger me. For example, holidays. I usually don't leave my house anymore on Memorial Day, because I know that is an event that is not good for me mentally. So I stay home. But a lot of the times it's just not something that you can see coming. And it's different for every single person. However, I can tell you from our experience, there's not a lot that she knows that she's going to do that might set me off. It's just something that happens, and it's hard for her to deal with, to have to go, oh, okay, we're there now, and be able to switch over and be able to handle things in a different manner than normal. So I just wanted to say that, as far as, some of the things that I know a lot of people ask, like, well, how do you know when you're going to get triggered? A lot of times I don't. It just kind of happens. So with that being said, we will turn it back over so we can do some of the question and answer stuff. And I look forward to those.
Okay. I wanted to draw attention briefly, and thank you, Rhiannon and Josh. That was great to listen to, very insightful. And I wanted to draw attention to some of the resources that have been shared. So, those are helpful to save in case you would like to share them with your loved ones. And now we will transition to some of the questions. Let me pull. Okay. So, and I will try to direct some of the questions from that were submitted previously, but I will also leave, everybody can answer. We had a question that was submitted about what coping skills are proven to be beneficial, and are there any especially well suited to veterans? And I think this would be more directed towards Dr. Serrata and Dr. Grau, but please, again, feel free to chime in whenever.
So in terms of coping skills, one resource that I think is a nice way to easily access this is called PTSD Coach. And it's freely available to download in the Apple and Android app stores. It's published by the VA, and it has several different coping skills that are helpful for managing PTSD. Dr. Grau, do you want to?
Yeah, well, I wanted to second that and just say that particular app is great, and I think it can give you some ideas of other places to look as well. So it's got a variety of different coping skills, breathing techniques, grounding techniques, and I think, like Josh has said, it looks different for everyone. So once you figure out what works for you, I think then you can kind of move forward and have some skills in your back pocket. So the PTSD Coach is a great way to start, and it was developed specifically for veterans at the National Center for PTSD. So yeah, that's where I would go.
Yeah. Josh or Rhiannon, did you have anything that coping skills that may work best or anything to add?
So my coping skills vary depending on my situation. I'm very much a fan of the grounding. When I get into those times and those spaces and things like that. But what I will say as far as um, you have to continue with talking to people, whether that be a therapist or friends or things like that. You have to supplement coping skills with other things, and that's what I've had to do to get me through some of these things. And whether that be you start looking into ART, EMDR, cognitive processing therapies, things like that to do that. But the coping skills, the groundings are wonderful for me. The one, two, threes, and things like that. But I found personally that I need to supplement those with additional things in order to maintain my mental health.
Thank you. So right, did you have something to add?
Yeah,
Sorry.
you're fine. He gets a little pointer happy. One of the things that I do more than anything is I tend to kind of reorganize things. I do have clinically dosed OCD as well, so we're kind of two peas in a separate pod, but the same plant. So organizing things, cleaning things. My biggest outlet would be like, painting some art, right? Some creative things, some Pinterest thing I found, and I go to the store and buy all these things. I sit and look at it, and then, 5 days later, I end up doing it. But after I'm finished doing it, that self, stepping back and looking at that, it makes me happy. And then wanting to get him drawn into the painting world is lots of fun too to have happen. But like trying to find that one thing that you don't think will work, taking that step and trying something new, I definitely highly, highly encourage that, because you never know what you're good or what you're not good at, or what you just have fun doing, even if you're both terrible at it.
Yes. So it definitely sounds like carving out some time to prioritize whatever may be healing for that
Yeah.
person.
That quality time too is when
Yeah.
you learn more about that person, those triggers, and what actually helps them. Like, hey, he had a really good time. Maybe we should do this again. Or he was frustrated the whole time. We'll never do that again.
Okay. Well, and yes, and the art thing is fun. That's been very useful for what I have experienced as well. So, um, I will, and some of the questions do align, so I will try to group them, or have a group of them that kind of go together. So from the chat, there is one that says, what is the best way to support a veteran with PTSD who repeats negative stories or dystopian ideas? Is it best to listen to the repeated narrative, attempt to distract them, or is there a particular healing approach in the moment that works best? And I know we kind of touched on that a little bit before about Rhiannon and Josh when you were talking about when to talk and when to listen.
Yeah. So and I'm looking at the question again now to make sure that I answered appropriately. Um, Listening is always best. It is a very fine line between listening without feeding in, because you can't feed into that narrative, because then you're just going to keep building it in their brain. But at the same time, you can't go against the narrative. So it's what I would suggest is being able to listen and support that person and the things they're thinking, but also then try and steer them towards being able to talk to somebody else, because because what ultimately happens is they're going to start thinking that way, and it is absolutely going to lead to some type of harm, whether that be a self-harm or other things like that. And that's the things that need to be avoided. So you need to be able to listen and let them vent out the things that they're talking about without giving into it or going against it, and being able to then, hey, maybe we should talk to this person, or maybe we should go about things this way. And it's a very delicate balance, I will say that. And there is no blanket answer for anybody. But the two main points that I would tell you is listen and don't feed.
And be careful of how many times you mention it. Because after a while, then it becomes nagging, and you don't want to be nagging. So you want to be supportive, but you don't want to completely alienate the whole concept or subject. So it's rephrasing it, I guess, would be the best way to describe that. Just rephrase the attempt that you're trying to do. It is a struggle. And, when we first started bringing up, counseling or therapy, that was not a word we would say in the house, because that was, it wasn't necessarily a trigger for PTSD, but it was a trigger for anger. Like, I don't have a problem. Well, okay, I can't say you do, because that would be an issue. But figuring that out on how to rephrase that, like, so and so went to counseling and they said this, or I read this thing today, or I would send them a link and not say a word. Different hints, different things, different phrases or ways to bring it up. And you slowly put that little bitty seed, and it starts to grow a little tiny plant. And then you can create something big and beautiful.
And I will say, as far as healing approaches, for me, for all the things that I've tried, for me, the cognitive processing therapy was the best. It worked the best for me. It is unfortunately probably the most painful one. It was extremely painful to go through, but when I got to the end of it, I definitely felt a lot better after that.
Thank you for sharing. Dr. Spatter, Dr. Grau, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just add that, what some of the core features of PTSD, as Dr. Grau talked about, are these negative thoughts about yourself and other people in the world. And these are core things that can come about after trauma exposure and with the development of PTSD. And one of the analogies that we use in cognitive processing therapy sometimes is that, the way that you think, these thought patterns can kind of become like wheelbarrow ruts. Like you go over them over and over again until they're really, set, and it's hard to shift them. And that's where talking to a therapist and doing some of this work, such as cognitive processing therapy, can be really helpful, because it takes a lot of effort and intentionality to start to shift some of these thinking patterns that are developed because of the PTSD.
Yeah. And this is kind of a nice segue into one of the chat questions was, are people ever considered cured of their PTSD?
That's a simple one, and I will tell you, no, they're not. There's no cure to PTSD. It can go into remission for days, weeks, months, years, but it's always there. It is
learning how to deal with it better.
Yeah, but having PTSD, it's a real shift in the way your brain operates and the way you operate as a human being, and it's not something that goes away. There are ways to lessen its impacts and things like that, but it is always there, 100%.
Yeah, and I think in therapy, one of the things that we have to move towards is the assumption that the PTSD is not, we're not going to remove this memory. We're not going to remove, this is a part of you, right? This is something that happened, and it has already changed you, and it will continue to change you. And then the relationship to the memory can change. And so over time, I guess the idea is not that when we think about cure, the idea is not that we remove the trauma, is that we help you get to a point where you're able to function much more effectively, and you're able to do the things that you care about, and manage the symptoms. And it does look very different for different people. Some people, will go through different treatments, and they have kind of very small flare-ups, at different parts in life. Some people might have one massive flare-up and otherwise do really well. So I think it's more of taking the long road and thinking about how can we really improve quality of life for people. And the treatments can absolutely do that. So I think that when we think of cure, sometimes people have this almost like it's a tumor and we're going to remove the tumor. And that's not necessarily what we're talking about when we think about moving forward with PTSD. It's much more about improving quality of life, and for some people, really, really getting the symptoms to a point where you're not thinking about it every day. You might not think about it for months, years. So that can happen for people, but I think, like Josh said, it's not that straightforward of a route.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Grout. And I know one of the things that I want to add on to that, and I said this before when I was talking earlier, is you'll have those flare-ups. You can go through and you can change the way you think about something. I went through therapy to the point where I spent 10 weeks every single day of the week in 5, 6, 7 hours a day group therapy, individual therapy sessions to help retrain how I was thinking. And it did a world of good for me, a world of good. And I came out of that and I felt much better. I felt like I was more relaxed. I could handle things. 2 years later, I was back in doing other therapies because things had come back up and they had changed. It was still some of the same events. So, you know, and it can get extremely frustrating when you are the person dealing with that to think that I had this under control and now and I'm not strong enough anymore to keep it under control. What's wrong with me? What's going on? And it'll lead you straight down those paths again. And as a loved one, it can be difficult to look at that. And he was doing so well, and now he's back here, and to have to go through the processing of that all again, because it is again, it's not a necessarily a fun experience, but you have to continue to hold on to that I did get better at one point. I can get better again, and I'm going to choose my life over anything else. And to be able to support them with those thoughts of, listen, you beat this, you had it, and you'll get it again. And if it comes up again, you'll get it again. And we're all here for you. And being here is much better than being somewhere else.
It's being like their cheerleader, or, knowing, having faith, definitely having so much faith, knowing that where he was and where we were, and having that faith of knowing 100%, I know where we were, we can get back, but having patience to do it, because it's not going to happen the same way it did the first time. Uh, it's constantly work. It's constant work. You have to put the effort in. If you don't put the effort in, you're not going to get, those rewards to your heart, to your family, to health. So it's constant work and not giving up and having that drive to keep going.
Thank you. And there's a few questions that sort of relate to PTSD within like the timeline of a service member. So a question from the chat for Josh is, what preventative suggestions do you have for someone joining the military or their family? And I guess this is partially for Rhiannon too then.
Yeah, so I will tell you, I've talked with some organizations, and I actually have family members that are working on this to how do we help preemptively do these things? How do we help set people up for success? Because that's one of the things. I mean, you take an 18-year-old kid or a 20-year-old kid who hasn't had these experiences, and you thrust them into it. How do you prepare their mind? You can do things, and you can suggest things like, for example, they are doing studies right now, and again, this is an ever evolving thing, and both Dr. Grau and Dr. Srapata can talk about this, where they're looking, can you do EMDR type therapies ahead of time to help your brain be able to deal with these things. But what I would say is, if you have somebody joining the military, just talk to them beforehand. Talk to them and let them know that, hey, man, we love you. No matter what happens, we're always here for you. And by God, go get some help if you need it. If you come across something that's bothering you, go get some help. And continuing to champion and cheerlead those people is the number one thing that you can do. We have a son who is currently a senior in college, and he's joining the military. He's actually an ROTC. And I will tell you, having been through the things I did when he came to me as a freshman in high school and said, I want to join the military, I told him, absolutely not. That is not going to happen. Go talk to somebody if you need to talk to somebody. At the end of the day, your life is more important than a job, and it always will be.
And that's that part where I said, make sure you talk to your kids about, the PTSD. Don't keep it a secret. It's not a weakness. It encouraged him to reach out to us to talk about it before he went and sought help afterwards. He's like, it's going to go on my record. It's going to do this. I'm going to be looked down upon. I'm going to be made fun of. I'm going to be treated less. It's not that your health is more important. He started getting depressed. His grades started slipping. So encouraging not just our kids, but our friends, our family, our neighbor, even if you see something, just reach out. I mean, I reach out on a regular basis if I see something funny on Facebook, and I'm like, that doesn't sound like that person. Like, hey, what's going on? You all right? Just casual message. It goes a long way, and no, having him not have a lot of friends when we first got together, and now seeing, our friend group, develop as well as it has. There's so many people that, I can reach out to, or they reach out to us, like knowing his history. We don't keep it a secret. It's something that I think has been a struggle for him, but keeping that out there and letting people know that this struggle is, yeah, we're open book, but the struggle's there and it's okay to have by everybody.
And I will say one last thing is that um, I came in the military before September 11th, 2001, before any of the wars and things like that. Um, I have seen the worst in military understanding and care for mental health. And I've had I know folks that were in Vietnam and things like that, and to where we are now. And I tell you, and I say this unequivocally, the military, the VA, and places like that are getting much, much better with their understanding and help on mental health. There are
Yeah.
many more resources than there used to be. Across commands, there is more understanding and a desire to deal with these things because they've seen what it can do to our formation and they've seen what it does to people when they get out. So I would let people know, hey, listen, there is a
It's not
much
the
better
same.
understanding in the military and the VA on how to help you and a more willingness to help.
It's a different military now.
And that actually, one of the questions is in regard to a system of screening and integration, if a better system would help members leaving active service. Do you have any comments on what you think would, for a better system of screening and reintegration?
Oh, yeah.
So what I will say is I will say there has been more of an emphasis on reintegration and when you get out of the military, whether it's an ETS or whatever or retirement, there has been a higher emphasis on mental health. Do I think that there's still a long way to go? I do. I think that there is a lot more that needs to be done post-deployment, pre-deployment activities that can be done. And I just think it's as we continue to try and raise awareness on post-traumatic stress and things like that, those things will come. They have gotten better. But yes, there does still need to be some system changes to deal with this. And I will say there's been a couple of things that have happened, like system changes as we're not going to allow people to deploy as much as they used to. There was a point in time where I deployed. I came home for 2 months. I deployed for 7 months, came home for 2 months, and deployed for another 6 months because there was no worry. Nobody cared about dwell time. Nobody cared about resetting your clock. It was all about go, go, go. So they have done a lot more that, hey, you're going to go for 6 months. You're going to come home. You're not going anywhere for 2 years to help with things like that. When you get out of the military, we're going to do some mental health screening when you come home. But one thing I will say is you still have to put this somewhat on the individual, and the individual needs to understand that when you get asked those questions, do you feel like harming yourself? If the answer is yes, you need to answer yes. That's where the engagement with your family members and things like that comes into play. Because I took a survey every single time I left, every time I came back, once a year, and any random time. And I'll tell you all those questions. Do you feel disconnected? Nope, I don't. Do you feel like you're going to hurt yourself? No, I do not. Do you feel all that? No, and you could because you know what you need to say in order to keep doing your job, or what you think you need to do to keep doing your job. But you need to take those steps, and encouraging people to take those steps again, being their champions is 100%. That's how you get past some of the system things that still have to catch up.
And I know, Dr. Sutter, you talked about reintegration, or Dr. Grau, do you have comments as well?
Yeah, a lot of the veterans I work with say that, the timing of these screens is critical, right? If you need to fill out the screen right before you're released, then you're gonna be rushing through it. So having, thinking about the timing that these screens occur and thinking about doing them more often or earlier on, providing information about services earlier on when people when soldiers actually have more time to take in that information and consolidate that information would be beneficial for a lot of the folks that I've spoken with.
Yeah, and I know there's also this push for unit command and leadership to be very actively making sure that the filling out of those screeners and just honesty in general are not penalized or punished in any way. And I think that there was a point in the chat about that where it's, yeah, over time the stigma lessens. You just giving people the opportunity to be honest and not having any potential barriers in the way when they do fill out those screeners is kind of critically important. So that's a lot of that's on administration. When do we give the screeners? That's what do we do afterward? Are we actually connecting people with care if they need it? If people ask for help, are we ready immediately to get them connected? So right now, I think there's a lot of effort. I know there's a lot of effort on the VA side of things, but there are also a lot of veteran organizations that are kind of fantastic, where they're trying to fill in gaps, which I wish they did not have to do so, but they're doing kind of a great job as well. So I think this is all hands on deck at this point to try to make sure that people are able to talk about what's going on and then also get connected to the care that they need.
Definitely. And yeah, I can attest to the stigma that was once around the VA and the experiences that I have had is, and my loved ones have had. The stigma is reducing, and there's a lot of work going on to really promote the VA and mental health. And so to transition into there's a couple of questions that were previously submitted and a question from the chat that are in regard to convincing those we love who may be experiencing PTSD to seek help. And if how to suggest that, and I know we touched on it briefly, like planting the seed. But is there anything else to add? How to possibly convince loved ones?
So, consistent engagement. It's one thing that when somebody says something or brings something up and you address it, then you need to be able to consistently engage. You need to check back in. It's the times that you will get through to somebody is the in-between times. So not necessarily when they're having an episode or or anything else. It's okay, you've had the episode or past the episode, it's a new day, you're in a more rational state of mind. Now we can have a different type of conversation. These things come and go. They ebb, they flow, and you have to find those valleys, not the peaks or things like that, to where you can then have that other type of conversation where it's, hey, you were saying these things. It upsets me to hear you say them because I'm worried about you. It's not you made me angry because you said this, or don't do that. It's hey, I'm worried about you, and I want to see you be the person that I know you are. And let's talk about maybe going to get some help, because that's when that's when you're going to be able to communicate with them. So it's
Timing is everything.
Yep. It is the engaging when they're at that peak, maintaining that engagement throughout, and then when they get in that valley where everything's peaceful, being able to have that conversation.
And even if you don't have that peaceful moment, that again, those small little moments of, even if you're making dinner, like, hey, did you think about anything more about what we talked about the other day about the counseling? Oh, I don't know, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, I just wanted to ask something small, something brief, not to cause an argument, not to rile them up at all, or her. Well, I mean, I've seen plenty of our military friends of, like, the female was deployed too. So it's, that concept of learning how and when to bring it up, and those opportunities that maybe we'll leave that out or bring it up now. And it's very hit or miss. So it's delicate situations.
And I would encourage folks to check out the link on Coaching into Care, which has a number of strategies that you can use to talk to your loved one about mental health and PTSD and seeking care. And it echoes a lot of the things that Josh and Rhiannon have just mentioned. Because yeah, it's a tricky conversation, and it usually has to happen several times. Yeah, but there's lots of resources on this page for how you might try going about doing that.
And I'm going to add one more thing. And this is the part that is not so well liked by some folks, but it is beneficial sometimes. So if you say it's your spouse or someone like that, military chaplains are very good resources to reach out to. If it is a retiree, you can reach out to the VA as a spouse or a loved one. You can reach out for things like that. There are lots of resources. So don't be afraid to educate you or educate yourself or call in reinforcements where you don't think you have that base to be able to do that. So I'm not advocating for everybody to call everybody's Army chaplain because or things like that. But if you are a spouse or a loved one or a parent, it is possible to go through some of those routes. I caution you to take all the factors into consideration because again, when they're in that extreme state, it can push them a little bit further. So you have to make sure you pick your timing appropriately.
And there is uh, to pivot a little bit away from off of that is for someone that is potentially taking a leadership position. There's a question, within the they hope to commission after as an officer. How would they be able to help future soldiers that may suffer from trauma when they may have not personally experienced it?
Well, hey, first, congratulations to you for going through ROTC and trying to commission and going down that route. I love new leaders, and especially ones who are trying to look out for their soldiers. So, the first thing I would tell you to do is educate yourself as much as you possibly can. Educate yourself on signs, symptoms, and treatment availability. Take time to engage with your soldiers. Whether it be individually, small groups, things like that, you can set up mental health awareness things, and continue to impress upon them the need to take care of themselves. We all feel that duty and that honor to do what we need to do as a member of the military. You need to impress on them what to do for themselves because that will be the part that they take care of last, and that needs the part that you need to take care of at the top of your agenda. So educate yourself as much as you can on the again signs, symptoms, and resources, and make sure you're engaging with them and making sure they take care of themselves.
Okay. And thank you for sharing that. I know we are drawing near to our end time. So again, I wanted to draw attention to the resources that are in the chat. They're great. And, please share those with your loved ones. And do we have any final comments from any of the presenters?
I just want to take a second to thank everybody that dialed into this webinar and anybody who's going to watch the recording, because this is a step that you're taking for yourself or for somebody else, and I greatly appreciate
Definitely.
that. This is something I'm very passionate about, having lived with it and through it, and still struggle with it, and I see friends all the time. So I just want to thank everybody for making this webinar happen and for attending or watching later.
Absolutely. I think this is a wonderful thing. And, it's another positive step in the right direction in getting that, did you mute me?
No, you're
okay. Oh, it popped up. But taking that step and reaching out, for those that may not have it or have somebody that, they know does, or it hasn't happened now, taking those steps to recognize it, seeing what's available and just being proactive about it is the first step going in the positive direction. So thank you all.
Okay. Well, thank you all for attending, and it's been a wonderful chat. And please take note again of the resources, and hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.